Okay, it started now.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to Philosophy Film Club, and thank you, Patrick, for letting me take the lead on this one and choose the art piece that we were going to look at here. What we're discussing is the Japanese OVA miniseries, Mobile Suit Gundam 0080, War in the Pocket. And I know the title's a mouthful, but it's definitely one of the most rewarding pieces of visual media that I've ever seen, and glad to see that there was enough interest that we could have this call here today. So for those of you who might be uninitiated, I'm just going to give a little bit of background about what's going on in the series, because the 0080 miniseries is just a small piece of the larger timeline focused on in the Mobile Suit Gundam series. And I'll just read this very concise description from Wikipedia here. Set in a fictional universe in the year 2079, or the Universal Century 0079 according to the Gundam calendar, the Principality of Zeon has declared independence from the Earth Federation and subsequently launched a war of independence called the One-Year War. The conflict has directly affected every continent on Earth, also nearly every space colony and lunar settlement. Zeon, though smaller, has the tactical upper hand through their use of a new type of humanoid weapons called mobile suits. After half of all humanity perishes in the conflict, the war settled into a bitter stalemate lasting over 8 months. So here the Earth Federation is kind of like the Soviet Union during World War II. At first, the enemy Zeon Blitzkrieg pushes them back into a corner, but very slowly, and just over the course of the last 3 months of the war, the Federation slowly begins to turn the tide in its favor, but still, in many cases, lacks experienced combat veterans, and there are numerous pockets where stiff Zeon resistance is still happening, as depicted in the 0080 miniseries. So I'll just pass it on to you, Patrick, and you can take it from here.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, this is a completely new genre for me. I mean, I've never really. I've been interested in some of the more famous anime, I guess, like Akira and stuff. But this it took a little bit of warming up, but I began to really get into the story particularly by about the third episode, and yeah, I'm really curious to hear what Jeff has to say. We've talked a little bit before the show just about where he was going with it, and I'm beginning to click with that. I'm beginning to understand that, and so yeah, definitely curious to hear. It's a very interesting, different for me at least, and show. And yeah, I'm curious. We've got a couple of callers on here, and we got Benjamin. I don't know, Benjamin, what were your thoughts on the? Just give us a brief outline of your thoughts initially watching on. You know, maybe you've known this series for a while, but I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts were.
Well, I first saw this series maybe 10, 12 years ago when I was a bit younger, as a teenager. And a lot of the different points on this story kind of fell on deaf ears when I was younger. But I do remember, like, it was a little bit different than most of the other, like, Gundam series. Like you'd mentioned earlier, I followed the series a lot, and this was one of the little hobbies that I had when I was younger. So I have a little bit of familiarity with the background and everything like that. But rewatching this series just recently really struck a lot of chords in my soul, I guess you could say. There's a lot of things that reminded me of childhood. It seemed like there was a lot of honest depictions of familial life, and I think that's one of the big things that I grasped out of this whole thing.
Yeah, no, I concur with you. It was like yeah, there was some really obvious stuff at some points, but then some more nuanced stuff, I think, as well. But you know, the school system, you know, was very much apparent in the whole thing. But also, for me, it was interesting how the father figure had literally stepped out of the picture. I think it was, I mean, and Jeff will be able to, or both of you might be able to tell me otherwise, But it was like the father only appeared in the first episode and the last episode, if I remember rightly. But anyway, it was interesting. So, how are we going to kick off with this, guys? Jeff, do you have any thoughts? How we maybe kick off with this?
Well, I'll just wrap up with my
Hey, you go.
personal
Sure.
experience of it, because I've got a couple of them very similar to what Ben was just talking about. When I was 15, that's when I got when I was 15, teenager. That's when I got into the Gundam series, and again, a lot of what was in them, a lot of the subtext and the different themes discussed really fell on deaf ears. And this one especially, because the first time I watched it, I was 22, I believe. And really, the whole time I was just angry and frustrated with Al for siding with the antagonists of the series, and I didn't have any had very little, if any, sympathy for what the characters were going through, because I thought they were all just making a huge mistake, acting on the wrong side of the war. Spoilers herein, by the way, for anybody who wants to watch the series first before listening to this. When Bernie is killed at the end and his remains are referred to as a pile of hamburger, I actually laughed. I thought it was funny, and I thought that Bernie got what he deserved. And then the second time that I watched the series, it was after I'd been listening to FDR for a while. I had been in the Air Force for almost 5 years. So I was 28 going on 29 at the time. Watched it again, and my perception was completely different. And there were a couple times watching it that I just teared right up. The second time watching it, I completely sympathized with Al and felt sorry for him, because I saw a lot of myself in Al when I was a child, and it really hit me hard. And it became one of my favorite. It became one of my favorite pieces of visual media that I'll rewatch from time to time.
Right, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I certainly sympathise with Al. I mean, he was, he was constantly trying to escape some perceived punishment that he might receive. That was the whole feeling I got for the whole watching the whole series. And I think if most of us kind of, I don't know, I mean, I speak for myself, and I probably, like, similar to you, if you have a similar experience, and I think a lot of people did, and a lot of children have had, given that the film, or the series rather, kind of gives that kind of obvious strain that children have to experience school in this way and that way, and they often have to experience their parents in this particular way, that it's not unsurprising that we kind of relate to those characters. And it's interesting that this series, I don't know, is this series directed at children? I imagine it must be. I mean, I'm new to this whole thing, so maybe there are adults that it's kind of directed at adults as well, as a marketing thing. But I get sorry, go on.
Well, the franchise as a whole, primarily, is directed at children or teenagers, perhaps young adults. The original 1979 series and then the 1985 follow-up series each ran, I think, between 25 26 half-hour episodes, and they were still considerably darker than, say, G.I. Joe, but nevertheless still aimed at children and designed to sell toys. But 0080 and also the 8th MS team, which I mentioned on the Film Club page, those were direct-to-video releases. They're what's called original video animation, OVAs, and those were more directed at adults who were interested in animation, and that's why the themes tend to be darker, more uncompromising, and why they follow more ordinary protagonists versus the what they call new types in the core series of this franchise, who are basically the next stage of human evolution. They have enhanced reflex times and basically superhuman mentally. Um, and the OVA series, like the 8th MS Team and 0080, didn't have that. It was about normal people trying to get through things.
Right. Right. Yeah. I certainly got the feeling that this is meant to be how most children experience life, because it was kind of like like a given sort of thing. The kind of I mean, initially there's this kind of big upmanship, which I found was interesting at the very beginning, where the little girl just joins in and says, "You're lying," and they're all bigging it up about what their fathers do, or what and that's very, very typical about children. Maybe it's more particular with boys. I don't know. I don't know if girls do that. Maybe they don't. And I don't know, because I grew up with a brother, so I never had some bullshit sister to deal with particularly. But I'm curious. It was that for me was an experience I remember experiencing myself as a child, but also remembering other children as well. Like there's this kind of big upmanship. Like my father does this, and he's like superhero kind of thing. And
Right.
that was
Right.
interesting. I thought.
Yeah. Right. Lots of one-upsmanship. You've got the female classmate who takes it upon herself basically to be the teacher's deputy,
Right.
and she's regularly antagonizing the boys as they go about their hobbies, misguided as they might be. Further angering them is not the way to get them to change their minds about anything. We may as well just focus on the school environment right now and the effect that it's having on these kids, because obviously one of Al's classmates is overweight. He's got an eating problem, so there's got to be some causes behind that. Certainly the school environment itself, probably also his family. They don't enjoy the food that they're being given there. I think they refer to it as synth meat at some point, so some kind of synthetic meat substitute that they're forced to eat.
Right.
Also, did anybody pick up that when Al is talking to Christina in the first episode, he mentions that they make the students do janitorial work, that they have to clean the toilets as well?
Oh yeah, I remember that. They were treating their kids like they were in the military.
Right.
That's a normal punishment or just regular chore in the military.
Yeah, I'm surprised I missed that bit, because I grew up, I was put in a military school. So, but yeah, I don't remember that part at all. But doesn't surprise me. There was a great deal of there wasn't any love lost for the school. I mean, when it closed down or something like that, everyone cheered. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It reminds me also when Al is trying to conceal that he's playing video games late at night when his mom comes in to nag him, and I think that's the yes mom, yes mom, yes mom scene.
Right.
Oh yeah.
He's pretty consistent in destroying the school in in that shoot 'em up.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most stirring scenes in the series, is when you see Al acting out like that, because he's, all day long he's being given orders and being told what to do, and then finally, with the video game, after those last couple of exchanges with his mother, he starts deliberately targeting the civilian targets in the video game, including one that is labeled, quote, "your house." He destroys that in the game and leaves only the monsters alive. Did you have any thoughts on that scene, Patrick?
Yeah, I do remember it being as disturbing as you guys describe it. It was a very obvious frustration he was having with his life situation. I think also just one of the thoughts is that he was dealing with a lot of boredom, because initially all this bigging up about, mobile suits and they don't exist or they do exist and stuff like that. And then he was like frustrated by his home life situation. His father was distant. I mean, you really didn't see his father. You didn't really connect with his father. His father was kind of this person that was this big overarching figure that was supposed to be landing in some place. He had to go there to meet him, and it was all he didn't have any real connection with his family. He didn't have other than he was just, this was where he lived and stuff. And so, yeah, that whole thing about destroying his town and very self-destructive in a sense, but also understandable given the lack of connection that he had with his his folks.
Yeah, certainly. Again, what you mentioned about the father. That's my memory of it too. Is that he does only appear in the first and the last episodes. And in the first episode, you don't even see his face until right before he and Al part ways. Actually, you just hear his voice as he and Al are exchanging things across the table, and then that's it. Yeah. Ben, did you want to say something?
Y'all mostly covered the things with his father. I didn't realize he had only showed up the first and last episode, though. But yeah, I think what's interesting too is also like just the way his mom deals with him all day. Whenever they interact, there's some sort of interrogation involved, and I like the way they showed Al's kind of like subconscious triggers and his like inner monologue. Like when in his discussion with his father, when he was sitting there and his father was asking him about his grades, Al was lying to him and saying B plus, C minus, and yada yada, and it shows a quick glimpse of his report card, and there's like D's and F's all over it. So,
Right.
and that's a common that motif is carried on throughout the series. Like they really get you inside Al's head in certain parts.
Mm-hmm. Right. There were a couple of moments where certainly agree with the points about Al's mother being more authoritarian than not in the house. But there were a couple of moments where she did show some compassion. There was a moment where they were sitting down at the table, and she observed that Al looked depressed, and she tried to have a bit of a conversation with him about that. Also at the end, when Al's on his way to the school assembly, and again with the father, one of the faults that I do find with the movie is that it makes the father into sort of a moron. Like he apparently takes a shower and then didn't bother to put a towel by the shower beforehand, and walks into the kitchen dripping
Right.
wet. Uses mother's apron to dry off, and then also, yeah.
That was very bizarre. That was, I thought, really odd how he just went up to her apron and just washed his face in it. It was kind of very strange, but yeah.
And then when Al leaves, he says, "Does he seem more mature to you? He seems so quiet now." He doesn't notice that something is bothering Al, but if you pay attention to the mother, she puts her hand up to her face, and she seems to suspect that something is wrong. So I think there is a little bit of there is some measure of genuine care on the part of the mother, in spite of her faults.
Sure. I was a little bit ambiguous about that whole thing where she was, looking a bit depressed, because he was depressed because obviously he was concerned that his mother was going to be told about his grades, and so actually he was kind of evading a lot, and understandably, because he was concerned, oh my God, my mother's going to kill me, kind of thing, and then there was this kind of like just acceptance. Oh, he said he's okay, but he kind of wasn't, right? And so I sort of sense, well, she might have some kind of connecting with how he feels. She doesn't really she's easily dissuaded when he says, "Oh no, I'm fine," so whatever was the expression that he would use,
Okay, right. So maybe she's more concerned about his performance in school rather than his actual emotional and mental well-being. Then
I think she was. I mean, at least that's the kind of feeling I get. I don't know if Ben disagrees or has a feeling about it, but that's how I felt. Yeah.
I sort of agree. And before I continue with my point, I have a quick question.
sure.
Do they imply that she works during the day, or is she kind of like a housewife? I never really had like a solid idea of like what she does. But do either of you remember whether they clarify that in the series?
I got the impression she was a housewife, essentially,
Okay.
but
Right.
I could be wrong. Maybe Jeff, you know better. I don't know.
Yeah, somehow I had the impression that she did work outside of the home, but I can't. But even just watching it again last night, I can't recall any specific instance where she mentioned having to go to work.
Yeah, I might just be like putting my experiences into it because my mom worked. But so one thing though that I thought about with their relationship, and I tend to agree with Patrick here, is that she did seem to be more concerned with his performance in school. The reason I say that though is because the way their normal relationship was Al pretty much concealing almost everything about himself in every single one of their encounters.
Right.
And every time at the beginning at least there wasn't very much like recognition of how Al was feeling, and of course I think he was definitely putting masks on so that to avoid being punished for bad grades or whatnot. But that's sort of what the impression I got out of it all.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I would say just what I'm feeling right now is I stand corrected on the bit about his mother caring for him on some deeper level.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think there are ambiguities thrown in, of course. I mean, I think there's a kind of a one of the things is there is this big cultural element. It is Japanese. I just don't know. I want to be careful I'm using this correctly, and it is Japanese initially. Or I may completely myself. Yeah.
Sorry, what was that again?
I said it is Japanese, Japanese anime, whatever.
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I found it interesting because what was it first produced in 1979, I believe? I don't know. Maybe that was the Wikipedia link I was reading, but
The original series that kicked off the entire franchise was made in 1979.
okay. When was this series particularly made?
This was 10 years after that, 1989.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting because there was a little bit of girl power thrown into this not massive amount with Christine, for instance. She got a little bit offended when she was told. I can't remember now the exact. She got a little bit offended about the idea that she couldn't control the Gundam or something like that. I think is that right? Yeah, and it's
Right,
a bit of girl power thrown into that, and I thought, oh yeah, there's some interesting cultural elements thrown into this that are kind of modern, kind of contemporary, lots of little women. Women are powerful at all sorts of things, of course, yeah, controlling a huge machine and stuff like that. Probably men generally are better at that sort of stuff, but there was this kind of of course she became this uber power, of course, eventually, So there was this kind of element of female superiority thrown into it a little bit, at least marginally, I don't know what you guys think, but I don't want to head down that course, but I think it's part of it a little bit,
Right. Well, in the other series, they did have very active female characters. This one, 0080 in particular, mainly that exchange, I think what they were getting at was really it's some exposition into exactly what that what the Gundam mobile suit is doing there. And what they're doing is they're developing actually for the protagonist of the original series, Amuro Ray, who is a new type. And that's what the technician is talking about. It's like, hey, don't take it personally. This machine
Right.
is this machine is designed for new types. You'd have to be some kind of freak to actually handle.
Right. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we notice it a little bit in, I forget what the little girl's name is that they're classmates with, that they sort of fight.
I
back
don't
and
think
forth
they ever
with.
get her name actually. I rewatched that scene where Al is complaining about her to Christina, and he doesn't mention the name.
Right. Yeah, so this nameless girl, but she seems to gets the one up on the boys a lot, and she definitely antagonizes them a lot. Um,
Hmm.
it's kind of interesting to see her invisible story arc, where at the end she gets kind of sympathetic towards Al.
Right. Yeah. There's that moment.
Yeah.
I think it's in the third or fourth episode of it where the other kids are actually trying to tell Al like, no, the Xeon are the bad guys. They're the ones who launched this entire war in the first place. But Al doesn't want to listen because he's already made friends with the Xeon team. And then yeah, she comes to his aid and and diffuses the situation by saying the teacher's coming. You better get back to your seats. And then yeah, I really like that moment at the end. It's really just an extra punch in the stomach after seeing everything that Al has lost, and now his friends and also his former harasser and his teacher are all fruitlessly trying to help him. I mean, they're all part of this system that produces either people who are so bored with standard civilian life that they want to go out and fight, or people who are so obedient to the state that they're also going to be instigating these horrible conflicts. It just really hits me extra hard to see them all try to help Al while they absolutely can't. Things are just going to keep going on as they always have been.
Yes, there is this kind of he learns some new knowledge and stuff, and so of course he kind of bullshits a little bit at the beginning about mobile suits, and then of course mobile suits exist, and then he gets this like lift, and then he gets this down when he then like talks about Xeon not being the enemy, and of course he forgets. I mean, this is really interesting that he lives in the same culture that everyone else lives in, right? But yet he seems kind of very adamant, like, I'm going to say Xeon are great and blah blah blah, and like he's surrounded by people that hate Xeon. I mean, they're obviously the enemy, right? And he's just completely dissociated from what he would expect from other people. I mean, that's interesting in itself, you know.
Right. Yeah.
It seems important to note there that his father, his absent father, works for Xeon's opposition, the Federation, right?
Right.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting. I always saw his bonding with Bernie as sort of a father replacement, and then I guess with that, Chris was his mother replacement figure, I guess.
Yeah, good stuff. Good, well spotted. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right. I think there were. I mean, I thought it was interesting that he called Bernie his brother. I thought that was really interesting because there was this kind of real connection between them. And of course, it was it kind of like faltered and failed occasionally, but it was actually it was a very warming moment, I felt, through the whole thing, that they actually really connected with each other. It wasn't just Al connecting with Bernie, it was also Bernie connecting with him, particularly when he saw the pictures that he drawn, you know, and and said, wrong hairstyle and stuff like that. There was a kind of like a connection there, right? Which I think he didn't share with his parents at all. I mean, there was virtually no connection, no personal connection, like, just the kind of matter of fact thing. Oh, you're good at science, son, or go to your, make sure you do all your homework, and all that kind of stuff.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, something just occurred to me actually. I think mainly what drew Al to get involved with the Xeon Special Operations team was it was really just the luck of the draw. Bernie's mobile suit, which is called the Zaku, by the way. Bernie's Zaku is going down and just happens to be close enough that Al can get to it. So it's kind of like being born on the wrong side of the border. You're expected to be loyal to whatever arbitrary line was drawn on the map, you know. So just by getting to Bernie first and forming that relationship with him, I think that's really what started his spiral of allegiance with this team. I think if Bernie instead had been a Federation soldier, then Al would be right on board with the Federation too, and probably drink the same Kool-Aid that you saw a lot of the other Federation soldiers swallow and then spew back out throughout the rest of the course of the series.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. So I'm curious, because obviously this had quite a big impact on you personally. I know we haven't talked a lot about it because we kind of wanted to leave it up to this particular conversation. But I'm really curious to know what was so connected for you in this particular series. What was so demonstrable about it that's kept you rewatching it over the years? And if that's not too personal, I mean, obviously, I'm very curious to hear.
For the most part, it's just the sheer number of interesting themes and topics that are in there. You've got abusive relationships, absentee parents, state indoctrination, both in the school and with the different military forces. Really, there's just so much to talk about with it, and specifically to the point of why I sympathized with Al the second time. Part of it was my own self-education with Free Domain Radio and going through actually being in the military for some time, but also I think a year or so before I rewatched the series, I had finished a screenplay that I submitted for professional coverage, for an actual working screenwriter to review. And in this story, I had a very bratty and unlikable child whom my protagonist essentially treated as an enemy. And the woman who covered my script wrote back to me, why is your protagonist treating this girl as an enemy? She's a child, and also her actions are really not what I would expect of a child. They're really sociopathic. Like she doesn't actually seem like a real person. And I sat back and I thought about it, and I connected that with what I had picked up from FDR about how human brains develop, and what you can normally expect of a child versus an adult, and that really clued me in. That was a big milestone in my own personal development. And so when I brought that knowledge to the series and finally actually saw things through Al's eyes as he was trying to just escape his mundane day-to-day life and do something exciting for a change, he got sucked into a horrible human meat grinder.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely I mean, this is where I go back to my original point, where I think a lot of children. This is why this series, I guess, is I called it. The series must be aimed at children because, and maybe subconsciously, whatever, I don't know, whatever. But I haven't read much of the background detail on it. But because I think this is how most children experience school, a lot of children experience their parents like these overlords, and kind of stuff, and
Right.
and I think I connected with it because I remember feeling deeply frustrated. I had to lie about my situation, maybe not to the extremes that Al did, but certainly I had to sort of keep myself to myself because it was more, I don't know, easier. Life was easier that way. And there
Sure.
was a great deal of frustration I remember feeling with the school system. Feeling like I mean, when I was younger, I know I'm 46 now, but when I was younger, I think I was like, it was 16 when you could leave school and you could go and start work. I mean, nowadays, I don't think most 16-year-olds, at least I don't know about at least in the UK, at least can't particularly find work very easily because the market isn't particularly geared up for them and can't deal with them particularly well and stuff. So but
Right.
back in my day, it was, and so all I wanted to do was get out and work, and it was like it was a sense of freedom in a weird way. I know a lot of people think work is a slave and it's a slavery itself, but it really isn't when you compare it to school. At least with work you get paid for it, and you choose which employer you work for, even though maybe sometimes you might not feel like you're choosing because you're a 16-year-old. You kind of have to like take the job that somebody offers you, but you are still choosing essentially. And yeah, and I remember feeling great elevation when I was able to get into that situation. It was a great sense of freedom, and suddenly I could take control of my life. Suddenly I could afford to live by myself. I could find somewhere, albeit not the most salubrious of accommodation, but I could find somewhere to live for myself. I could pay my rent. I could pay my electric. I could do all this stuff. There's a kind of real sense of self-autonomy in that. And with Al, I think, at least the way that it was a constant search for him for a self-autonomy, for finding his ability to do stuff. This is why he wanted to work for the whatever they were called. I can't remember, the special forces guys. And this is, it's really his way of expressing his freedom. It's like, this was more exciting, this is more interesting, this is more my choice, sort of thing, rather than everything else was not his choice, right?
Yeah, certainly. And we see that. Yeah, we see that in the first time he meets Bernie, he's willing to trade his digital camera over to Bernie just for this. I'm not sure what that was. Whether it was a unit patch or no, it wasn't the unit. Yeah, I think it may have been his unit patch or a rank badge, whatever it was. He just wanted this piece of colored fabric versus a piece of high technology.
Yeah, that was really interesting, wasn't it? Because that was that was a little bit related to the big upmanship. I've got, because the girl had come with badges before. I think she came with
Hmm.
badges of admirals and stuff, and and so yeah, he was thinking, oh, I'm going to get one up on everyone else. So that was the point. Although he actually never did that. I think he I think he kept it private. Perhaps, I don't know. He never really made a made a claim about this badge that he received. It was literally like you say, it was kind of, oh, I think I've stepped up or something, or at least in his mind. Yeah, it was interesting. He could give up his camera, and which was probably worth far more realistically. But for
Hmm.
him, there was a kind of status in all of that, and yeah, I mean that might be problematic in a sort of in a more deeply philosophical way, but for a child, it kind of makes sense, in his situation.
Sure, yeah. And if he had decided to make a big deal out of it, he could have very well said, well, this came from an actual soldier on the battlefield. It wasn't something that I got at the toy store.
No, of course, yeah.
Right. I also thought it was I also thought it was interesting that yeah, he didn't make a big production out of it. It was something that he just sort of kept to himself, and even after he seems to recognize the racket that he let himself get drawn into, he still keeps it on his hat, and I think he's doing that as just a reminder of the friendship that he had with Bernie. I mean, I've still got my framed going away lithograph from the Air Force up on my wall because I mean I liked the people I worked with. They were I mean aside from being state agents, they were good people who were easy to work with. They helped me, I helped them, and I'm grateful that they took the time to make this gift for me and then sign it and present it to me.
Right, right. Did you have any thoughts, Ben, at all? Well, I don't want to push you, but I'm just curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can kind of see like maybe Al felt getting that insignia might have been like a status type, maybe subconsciously more so because but I can't ignore the fact that no one ever found that Zaku in like the week or so that the events this show unfolded. But I mean, it was like right there, right off the road. But yeah, he definitely. I think what was going on though too was he was starting to distance himself from his friends and peers at school in a similar way that he did with his family. It was almost like the Xeon troop, that group that he sort of attached himself to, became his new like system of, I guess, friendships, but not exactly like healthy friendships. But they had a similar dynamic to how his group was. They were constantly bragging and antagonizing each other, and being one-upsmanship, sort of like this sort of I guess bullying, I think is a good term for it in some instances, but not necessarily. But you see that with Bernie's peers too. He kind of did. There's a big similarity between Al and Bernie in that instance.
Yeah, there is, isn't there? I was constantly thinking about the Special Forces captain being almost like the mother of, but being the Uber mother of Al's, sort of thing. It was a kind of alternate situation, the adult situation and the child situation. You got a kind of glimpse into the adult world a little bit. I don't know what do you think, Jeff?
Yeah. Well, particularly with the captain, his name is Steiner, by the way. He
oh right, yeah.
Just mentioning him as being like the Uber parent. Well, at the very end when Bernie decides initially to give up, he reveals to Al that the Special Forces badge that they gave him was bugged, so they've been listening to him the entire time. Well, it had to be the captain's idea because Steiner was the one who gave him the badge, and given the examples of other adults that we've seen in the series, I thought that was entirely appropriate for Steiner to bug Al and use him in some fashion like that.
Right, yeah.
Right. Just a little bit more about Al as a whole. Because Pat, you mentioned that the franchise mainly is geared toward children. Perhaps not this one so much because there is a lot of blood flying about it. But with Al being the protagonist, he basically is the target demographic of the other series in the franchise, right? Because they'll feature teenagers or young adults. Of course, this includes Voltron and Robotech, which American audiences are probably a little more familiar with, especially if you grew up in the 80s. And they all put these young protagonists in the pilot seat so that the viewers at home can imagine themselves being in that position and what a great adventure it might be. So then 0080 turns that on its head and is like, okay, well, here's our target demographic, this little boy that we're selling this stuff to, and we're going to show him what this would really be like if he were involved in it.
Yeah, I have that exact same point written right down right here. Yeah, Gundam has, yeah, they have a pretty long history of using children and young people as protagonists. I mean, some of it's pretty absurd, but it, I mean, it makes me think of a lot of different indoctrination tactics, though, used around the world, like like Africa. You see children shooting people and craziness. It's
Right.
so like I kind of saw these weird little glimpses of Al being sort of that suburban version of that, um, where he sort of is one of the few that gets involved at such a young age in his community, but really everybody that's like their fantasy already.
Mhm.
Um, as far as like the perspective of it being from a child's eye, I think it's kind of interesting how in a lot of the Gundam series they portray the mobile suits as very a little bit more fast moving. We see a little bit of that when they have some of those skirmishes in space at the beginning of the series here, but when they're on ground inside the colony, whenever Al experiences or perceives them, sees them across this like strange landscape, they kind of look more like pieces of artillery, like equipment,
Right.
rather than like these space people zipping around out in zero G, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This one and Eighth MS team, they both treat the mobile suits as actual pieces of hardware that will break down and that are only as good as the pilot inside. And again, like we see at the end of 0080, if you've got the equipment and the pilot, like yeah, using just the base assembly line Xeon model Zaku, you can get the jump on the Federation's new weapon um, and defeat it, even though at the cost of your own life, perhaps.
Right. So, was there anything else that particularly that you guys had any thoughts on particularly about it? I kind of touched on most of mine, unless you can trip my mind into something that I'd forgotten about. But I'm curious if there's anything else that you really wanted to touch on in this series.
Right. Well, we can talk some more about the just the depiction of combat within the
Yeah.
series. To start, of course, it starts off with this battle scene as the Cyclops team. I just remembered that's what they're called. Cyclops team, as they're moving in. The music is relatively bright, lighthearted, and of course the Cyclops members, they're enjoying themselves as they're wreaking havoc among the Federation base, and yeah, it's all a lot of fun, just kicking ass and using human shields and all this, but then they lose one of their own and they fail to stop the launch. And then right after that, we're greeted with this very somber music and these lingering shots of wreckage and blood pouring out of cockpits, which the bloody cockpit thing is repeated throughout this series and others. And it really just triggers your imagination to think like, oh man, if that's what's happened, if all of that is flowing out of the cockpit and that's the damage that's been done, like what does the person look like inside?
Right. Yeah. It was. I think it was the fourth episode where there was a lot of blood. I think it was the fourth, or maybe it was the third. I don't know, but definitely lots of firefights and like you say, like that blood pouring out of the machine or out of the rather the this what they call it, the bodysuit or whatever. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's the beginning of the fifth episode, so it's right after the Alex Gundam
Fair,
manages.
that's it. Fifth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Christina manages to take down the Kempfer, and Misha is killed inside. Then, yeah, in the beginning of the fifth episode, you see the Kempfers being disassembled, and they've taken out the seat, and it's just riddled with bullet holes and gore. And
Right.
also, you also see his flask has been torn apart by the artillery as well.
Oh yeah,
Right.
and then they show us the wreckage afterwards or across the town after the
Yeah,
schools. Yeah, and I recall Al walking by a scene where they were pulling out a child out of the wreckage, and I think he began tearing up and sort of lost his wits right there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that was a big turning point for Al is when he sees the child being pulled out of the wreckage, and right, he runs away, and at first he's unable to eat his meal with Bernie because he mentions, boy, people die really easily, don't they? And depends on who you ask. Like if you ask somebody who designs execution equipment, lots of times they'll say, well, it's difficult to kill a person. Of course, they're talking about doing it humanely. Um, but um, but as far as inhumane ways, which is what war naturally entails, yeah, it is very easy to take a life, especially if you don't mean to.
Yeah, he gets a lot of insight there, I think, into what happens with violence and stuff. I think
Right.
that was my sense. Yeah, and sorry, I mean I'm taking a dub sale here a little bit, but unless you guys wanted to sort of particularly concentrate on that area, but I was curious. Suddenly, it's just something that dawned on me is we haven't talked a lot about was the character of Christine. Now I know we talked a little bit about her being perhaps a mother figure and stuff like that, but I think there's something more to her. I think, and I haven't really been able to had the time to process what I thought about her, but she is a main character. She's almost as big as Bernie in the character, really, rather in the series, you know. But I'm just curious what you guys had, what your thoughts were on her.
I thought she was generally like the people I used to work with. Uh, for the most part, good, certainly a good person, but compartmentalizing. Because she tells the detective, well, if I didn't fight, there would have been many more who would have been killed, and the detective tells her, well, I understand what you're trying to say, but the number of victims isn't the point. I mean, nobody should have to die just because, quote, it couldn't be helped. Um, uh,
Right.
what'd you think, Ben?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was actually scribbling something at the moment. Could you reiterate what you said?
No
Just
problem.
what are your thoughts on Christina?
Oh, okay. Well, I have 2 points about her. There's Al's interactions with her, and then Chris and Bernie. Those are
Okay.
like the two relationships she really even like shows. Aside from with her parents, who sort of just upsell her the whole time. They just seem like really, really nice people for some reason. I don't know why, but um, so I'll touch on Chris and Bernie's relationship first. With There's a couple layers to it because there's a bit of a star-cross implied romance as Bernie seems to develop some sort of attraction to her.
Right.
Um, and that's pretty common, I think, in a lot of war stories, but except these two are both actually like soldiers, so that's a little different. But
Mhm. Right. Yeah.
I
So
think
yeah,
it.
soldiers on the opposite sides of the conflict,
Mhm.
but they don't know it. Um,
Right.
yeah, they do know it in the Eighth MS team. Which any listeners out there, it's only about twice as long as 0080 is. So certainly give that a watch too.
Yeah, that
Right.
one was pretty good. That one's pretty good, and it's a little bit more modern. Um, yeah, so I think like it's pretty important in Bernie's development of a character. I don't really see as much change in Chris. I think she seems to have a reaffirmed belief, as you can see, like in her last dialogue with Al at the very end of the series. She sort of
Right.
espouses her motives for everything. But um, it's pretty important, I think, in Bernie's development, though, how he interacts with Chris and how he thinks about Chris, because I think he's finally starting to see some sort of empathy for people or sympathy for people on the other side of the conflict, because he sees this decent person that he lets himself sort of have a crush on, yet she fights for the enemy side. So we don't see him ever really develop that empathy for himself, though, because he had a chance to run, but he didn't.
Right. Good
But
Yeah.
point.
yeah, like with Al though, she she's like one of the few positive figures in his life, I would say. Um, as as like Bernie is he has a strong bond with, but I think Bernie was kind of the wrong sort of type of person to get involved with, especially for a young child.
Certainly.
But with Chris, she kind of leaves out the whole military side of her life when she's discussing things with him, aside from mentioning whether she's being transferred to one base or another. But I think that's kind of interesting. But they they don't show a lot of difference with her growth. They do show some things in her career, her frustrations at being, I guess, subpar compared to these so-called new types or whatever. But it, I guess I guess she's a really static character though.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I think the closest you get to any sort of epiphany with Christina is when she's talking to Al, and I think it's in the fifth episode, and she says, and Al is trying to get her to reaffirm his opinion that Bernie's a coward for not continuing this fight on his own. And she says, "Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that each person has an individual choice to make whether to fight or to run away." And of course, she's not considering the better option, which is to run away with those you care about and get them out of harm's way along with yourself. Um, also with Christina and the compartmentalization, she's not a regular. She's not a combat regular. She's a test pilot. So I think it's a lot easier for her to disassociate her home life from the battlefield.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. And that's probably why she doesn't seem too broken up about, aside from just a physical injury. She doesn't seem too broken up about the engagement with Bernie the day before. Of course, she didn't know it was him. But even so, I think she was still seeing it more as just another simulation that happened to hurt her. But she feels that she'll be okay because apart from that, it wasn't that different from just the test that she had been running.
Right. So she wasn't so emotionally. I don't know. Not so emotionally involved in the war. Perhaps, I don't know.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't. Yeah, no, it wasn't taking the toll on her psyche that it was on Bernie and the rest of the Cyclops team and other people who were actually experiencing the fire and the bullets day to day.
It's pretty shocking though because she did manage to kill 2 people before the series was done.
That's true.
But I think what you just mentioned though, when you said how she never knew it was Bernie that she killed at the end. It's kind of interesting because I want to actually back it up to the blood pouring out of the cockpit motif. When Bernie dies, his cockpit is just exploded. I don't even think there was really blood that could be seen. It was just everything was annihilated. So
Yeah,
it's kind of
Yeah, I can't recall offhand what it actually looked like.
yeah. I think it was just sort of smoke and debris. So it's kind of interesting that they didn't. Probably, the creators had some sort of respect or bias towards the character as they designed it to make it not as gruesome for a main character to die in such a way. But I also think, though, that if we consider the importance of how they portrayed the mobile suits and the deceased pilots within them, it's sort of I want to say it seems there's an important connection with it with how people don't know who they're killing inside these mobile suits.
right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I got that sense as well because because that was a great disguise between Bernie and Christine. Of course, they really didn't know at all at any point. This is why I guess Christine perhaps didn't even know right up until the end. Well, she didn't know, of course, and yeah, there was this way of like hiding behind these facades, essentially. Again, not something I particularly processed, but just I clicked with that. That sort of makes a lot of sense with this whole thing. In a sense, it goes back to his parents not really knowing who he was, who Al was rather, and him not really knowing what his parents were like. I don't know, again, it's a sort of maybe a more deeper way I'm looking at this, but it sort of connects with that, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't really think of it that way, but that's kind of interesting way to put that.
Right. Yeah, I had some notes on compartmentalization also. I think you also see this when Al and Bernie are working together to repair the Zaku, and again the music turns bright, and they're having a lot of fun doing it. And just the observation that I had and wrote down was that yeah, you can compartmentalize and have fun, just focus on the job ahead of you and make the most of it that you can. But once you actually look at the big picture, at all of the facts and everything that's happening around you, that can zap the fun out of it really easily.
Yeah. So what's your take generally about what's the caveats that you take from this this series particularly, and I'm going to ask you individually, and I'll give you my thoughts on it as well, but I'm curious to know what the caveats are about this series that you feel kind of relate to philosophy, to life, to our own personal experience with people, and how we interact with the world and stuff like that. Maybe that's a bit broad, but you know what I mean. I'm just curious to hear how you relate this story to life itself.
Sure. Yeah, there are a couple of overarching themes that I've noticed of indoctrination, whether it's by your family or by the state or by somebody else, and drawing you into something that is really not good for you, for your mental or physical well-being. I think there's a really good and clear example of this when Bernie is in the spaceport and orders a drink for himself, and then he hears that woman go over to a payphone, and she's clearly talking to an ex who doesn't care for her company anymore, but she still wants to come back to him. So she's trapped in this, or she wants to stay in this abusive relationship, and this conversation was Bernie's impetus for returning to the battlefield, and he admits that in the tape that Al was given. He says it's not about can't recall offhand what he says. He says it's not about this, it's not about that, and it's hard to explain, but I want to fight now. I want to fight the Gundam, and maybe it's just because I'm a soldier. So I think that's one of the key takeaways from the series is that it's a real tragedy if you can't take every so often take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
Right. Oh, how about you, Ben? What were your caveats on this, if you have any? But curious.
I think it's a really good movie if you want to counter sort of the glorification of fighting that, say, maybe like Star Wars has, where Luke sort of runs away to fight and there's not really any ill will involved with that. It's sort of just what everyone's doing, I guess. But in this, we see this young kid that wants to get away and wants to find something to fight for, I guess, and eventually sees the cold, hard reality of what war is all about. It's definitely one of the more, I hesitate to use the word, but universal type of stories that Gundam's ever put out. It's very easily like something I can identify with as far as how Al grows up and his interactions in public school and the way his family is organized. And at the end of the series, every time I've watched it, I've seen it like maybe three or four times now, but I always sit there wondering, like, well, what does Al do for the rest of his life?
Right.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, that's a good observation because during the credits, at the very end of the credits, you see that still photo of Al with his classmates holding up the Happy New Year sign, and they're all smiling. And he, at least in that still image, he doesn't seem to be trying to force back any pain. So you wonder if it's something that actually stayed with him, or if it's something that he quote got over or just forgot about, and you wonder if he's gonna just continue down the same spiral that Bernie and the other combatants and unfortunate civilians did.
Yeah, I kind of I was left with a. I don't want to say disappointed because I wasn't disappointed by the series. I thought it was really interesting to watch, but I did get the sense that, and this might be just me being a newbie to this whole genre and everything else, but I did get the sense that, well, not Birdie Brother, but Owl had not really connected the dots of what had happened. All this disconnection, all this subterfuge behind bodysuits and, parenting style, whatever you want to call it, and all these different parts. I got the sense that he was drifting into the same kind of, potentially was drifting into that same kind of cycle, and
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't get the sense there was a kind of liberation for Al at all. But I, on the other hand, I didn't get a sense of, I didn't feel utterly despondent about it. I mean, I still, in a sense, there was a kind of happy ending in some senses insofar as, there wasn't nuclear destruction and all that kind of stuff, But
Sure.
I felt there was this kind of, he was being recycled into the culture of what he just experienced. He was just it was just going to remake itself in a different way in the future, and that perhaps, I don't know, he'd become like Bernie or he'd become like his father. I don't know. It didn't seem to be any kind of end to that kind of the way that people weren't being truthful with each other. This is kind of what the bodysuit thing, right? The bodysuit, in a sense, was a way in which people could disguise who they were, and that was a kind of metaphor for the whole thing. That, in a sense, Al was left. Well, I need my bodysuit to protect myself from, people around me and stuff, and people that supposedly care about me or whatever, and so there was a kind of, I felt that he hadn't really connected with that. Maybe mine's a more depressing outlook, but
Yeah, no, I definitely think there's definitely ambiguity in the end. Like I said, you do have that still where he's smiling and holding up that sign, the Happy New Year sign. I think there is a glimmer of hope and a hint that he understands the system now. And it's because when he's at the assembly, it's exactly at the moments when the principal is giving that speech about how he hopes that all of the students will grow up and work to create a world where this sort of thing won't happen again. It's at that moment that Al is breaking down, and I think that's very similar to the end of Lord of the Flies. How at the end when Ralph sees the naval officers all dressed up, and there's a very clear rank structure and they're very obedient, but he seems to recognize that it's just a manufactured form of order, and he's experienced what the author's view of what the truth of humanity is. I don't think it's entirely accurate, especially given that they were all military cadets in that story. But I thought just as Ralph at the end of Lord of the Flies was weeping for humanity, I think that's what Al was doing during the school assembly, is that he hears these very hopeful and inspiring platitudes from his principal, but the system that's set up with the Earth Federation and the municipal governments, it's still going to just keep things going in exactly the same direction.
Right, right. Yeah, I think you're right. There is some ambiguity there, and I probably need to watch it again to really kind of connect with more of the nuance of it. But yeah, definitely really interesting. And I will definitely be watching some other stuff. So if you guys could recommend me some stuff, it's not stuff I've ever really listened to much or watched before. I mean, Akira is my only backbend. Akira's completely different to this, by the way. So I don't even know why it's even related. It doesn't really have bear any relationship other than it's a cartoon, you know. But,
Akira would be a good discussion.
It's just a similar animation style.
Yeah,
That's really it.
Yeah, but it's very different. Were there any? I mean, we're sort of coming towards the end, but I was just thinking, was there any last sports you guys wanted to talk about this, and anything that you thought we've missed out, and you know?
Before the call started, Pat, you and I were talking about the music, and for a long time, for a long time, I really didn't care for the J-pop opening theme. But I recently read another review, and I wish I could give the author credit right now. But his view of it was that it helps to juxtapose Al's world, or Al's normally carefree world, versus the harsh reality of the war that's going on outside their colony, and then later on in the series, actually inside it.
Right, right. I guess some of my oppositions to that, or not opposition to what you're saying, but my opposition to the music was it felt terribly sentimental.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. I mean, there is a lot of sentimentality in childhood, of course, when you're living in a situation of I don't know, where people aren't listening to you and stuff, and so sentimentality is something that you can cling on to in childhood, I think, as a means of making sense of the world that you live in. So there's nothing particularly wrong with that, you know.
Yeah. One final minor point I'll just touch on was another one of my criticisms of the series is that the rogue Xeon commander who sends the nuclear missile, tries to send the nuclear missile to the Rhea colony, his name is Commander Killing. It's like you can't hit that on the nose any harder, right?
Right, yeah. Commander Killing. Yeah. Did you have any last thoughts, Ben, at all, or
I was trying to Google something up just in case anybody that's caught this and watched the series and is utterly depressed about it, about especially the characters. If they like the characters, they made some cameos in some other series, so if you just want to see their face living, then you can see them there. But I don't remember which series it was.
Right.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Yeah.
Yeah,
also,
it shows all the whole group of them, all they're sitting there happy. It's like, hey, it's those guys.
And I guess people can just Google that with Gundam sort of, I don't know, images or something. I don't know.
I think if you just Google the character names, you can probably come up with screenshots of their other appearances. Of course, over the years, a number of video games have also been made based on the franchise, and one that I used to own for the PlayStation 2 when I was in high school, you could, as you played like these challenge missions that weren't related to the story, you could unlock different characters and different mobile suits, and you would get these videos of characters from 0080 and from the 8th MS team greeting you in this lighthearted fashion. It's like, oh, well, it's good to see you alive and well again. Shiro with both your legs. Anybody who's seen 8th MS team, yeah, the ultimate cost for Shiro is he loses a leg at the end of it.
Right. You know what? It's just you reminded me, and I don't know why it reminded me, but the whole thing you talk about the bodysuits. This thing reminded me of Transformers. I don't know if it has any relationship at all to it, but it kind of reminded me. And I'm not really particularly a huge Transformers fan. I think I've watched one movie and a couple of episodes of the old cartoon series. But does it have any relationship with this series at all? Or?
Probably in some fashion, it helped serve as some kind of inspiration for Transformers.
Yeah.
Gundam is really the genesis of what some call the real robot genre, where these massive machines are built by humans, by human militaries for specific purposes, and they don't have a mystical or an alien origin like in Voltron or Big O.
Right. Yeah, cool. I mean, yeah, I think actually this would be. I was definitely not a huge fan, but now I'm a little bit of a fan, and I'm going to be. I think I might. If you guys could recommend me some other, maybe we can have some more Gundam discussions, because I think they're really interesting. Certainly from a socio situation, particularly with the family and stuff. I mean, I think it's fascinating how, particularly Japanese culture, is very reserved. So actually, you see a lot. Perhaps you see a lot about not just Japanese culture, of course. I mean, I think even Western culture and stuff like that. I think it's quite interesting, from a philosophical perspective. I mean, I'd quite like to. I was not hugely enamored. I mean, I say I wasn't like, oh yeah, I must. Jeff, you brought it up, of course, and you very kindly wanted to do this show on it, and I think great, but I wasn't like hugely excited about it. I thought, okay, I'll watch this, but actually, the last week when I've been watching this stuff and episode by episode, I actually found, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of really good quality subtext and stuff in it. It's very interesting. And it actually reminded me a little bit about my long-held episode which I'm going to be producing at some point on Full Metal Jacket. It sort of had some resemblances there, but I might touch on that when I actually finally produce that piece of work. but yeah, it was very interesting, and thanks for bringing it up, because it wasn't something that immediately grabbed me at all. And thanks, Ben, for joining. I mean, cool. I think the first time you joined us, so
yeah, I finally made it.
yeah, that was cool. And I mean, this sort of stuff. I mean, in the film club, I want to sort of put this out to listeners. If you've got something that's really of interest to you, hey, it might not interest me immediately, but I'm certainly behind people who want to do stuff like Jeff's done today and in the future. So bring it on. Let's at least educate Pat here in other stuff. So I'm very curious to hear the excitement and enthusiasm that people have for other films and stuff. So yeah, good stuff. So any last thoughts, or should we call it a day? And
yeah, well, yeah. Thank you once again for the kind words, Pat. And I'm glad you kept an open mind about it, and that you found the same value in it that I do.
Yeah. No, thanks. All right, guys. Well, let's call it a night or a day, wherever you are in the world. But no, thanks again, and I do promise to get Full Metal Jacket out as soon as possible. I have been rather busy with work, but be patient. It will be a good one, I promise. But anyway, all the best, everyone. All right.
Right. Great.
Have a good
Take
one.
care, guys.
Bye.